The first rule of galactic survival. Deadworlders don't know they're supposed to die. Part 1. Classification Error. Archivist Velmis Talk had processed 11,000 species applications in her career, and not once had her hands trembled while reading a file. Until today. She sat in her small office on orbital station Cathara Prime, all four of her arms resting on the curved desk, and stared at the planetary survey data glowing on her screen. Sol 3. A little blue and green world circling an unremarkable yellow star on the outer edge of the Orion Arm. The file had arrived that morning from the Long-Range Contact Division, with a simple note attached that read, "New species application for Provisional Galactic Union membership." And Velnis had opened it the way she opened every file, with mild boredom and a cup of warm kellet broth. She was not bored now. The broth had gone cold. She scrolled through the environmental data one more time. Certain she had made a mistake. Certain the numbers were corrupted. Certain that no living thing could come from what she was reading. The atmosphere was 21% oxygen, a gas so reactive that most Union species kept it locked in sealed laboratory containers and handled it with extreme caution. The planet had active tectonic plates, which meant the very ground moved and split and swallowed cities without warning. 70% of the surface was covered in a universal solvent that the inhabitants casually called water, and they swam in it for fun. The axial tilt was 23 degrees, which meant the entire planet underwent catastrophic seasonal shifts every few months, swinging from burning heat to killing cold and back again. The local star blasted the surface with ultraviolet radiation hard enough to damage cellular tissue, and the inhabitants responded to this by lying in it on purpose to change the color of their skin. Biosphere was an unrelenting war. Every living thing on Sol 3 was either trying to eat something or trying not to be eaten, and many of them were trying to do both at the same time. There were creatures in the oceans large enough to swallow a shuttle, insects that drank blood, plants that dissolved living tissue, fungi that hijacked the nervous systems of other organisms, and microscopic predators so aggressive that the inhabitants fought a never-ending invisible war against them every single day of their lives. The classification system went from Class 1, which meant a gentle paradise world, all the way up to Class 12, which meant a planet so hostile that no surveyor would land on it without a full military escort. Sol 3 scored a Class 12. No sapient species had ever evolved on anything above a Class 7. Velmis checked the file source code for corruption and found none. She ran the data through two separate verification systems, and both confirmed the results. She sat very still for a long time. Then she called Bureau Director Halomi. Halomi was a Grenthari, a large and slow-moving species that prided itself on calm, rational thinking, and even he went quiet for an uncomfortable stretch of time after Velnis showed him the numbers. "This must be an error," he said at last. "I have verified it 3 times, Director." "Then verify it a 4th time." She did. It was not an error. The human delegation arrived at Cathara Prime 6 hours later, aboard a ship called the UES Montevideo, and Velnis watched the docking feed from her office, with all 4 hands pressed flat against the desk. There were 4 of them. They walked off their ship and into the reception bay with an ease that made Velnis deeply uneasy, because creatures from a Class 12 world should not look so relaxed. They should not be smiling. The one in front was a female called Captain Josephina Marin, and she had dark hair pulled back from her face, steady brown eyes, and a posture that radiated quiet authority without any visible effort. She shook hands with the reception officer, a Veldrathi with a reinforced exoskeleton, and the Veldrathi winced. Captain Marin did not appear to notice. Director Halomi ordered a full biometric and threat assessment on all 4 humans, to be conducted quietly and without their knowledge, and the results came back within the hour. Velnus read them and wished she had not. Humans were persistent predators, which meant they did not chase their prey fast, but instead followed it at a steady pace until it collapsed from exhaustion, sometimes over distances that spanned entire days. Their skeletal structure was dense and heavy, reinforced by a gravity well 30% stronger than the galactic average. Their muscles were anchored to their bones with a tensile strength that most species only achieved through cybernetic enhancement. They consumed a chemical called capsaicin, a substance that triggered intense pain responses in nearly every known nervous system. And they ate it on purpose because they enjoyed the sensation. They drank ethanol, a solvent and a poison, in social settings for recreation. When threatened, their bodies flooded with a hormone called adrenaline that temporarily increased their strength, speed, and pain tolerance to levels that the assessment software flagged as outside acceptable biological parameters. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they had a psychological tendency to form intense emotional bonds with creatures that were not members of their own species, including animals that could kill them. They kept predators in their homes and called them pets. They mourned when these creatures died. They loved things that could eat them. Halomi read the assessment in his office while Velnus stood by the door, and when he finished, closed the file and sat in silence for a very long time. "Classify this as eyes only," he said at last, "and send an urgent dispatch to the Union Security Council." "What should I tell them, Director?" "Tell them we have made first contact with a Class 12 species, and tell them that the species does not appear to know what it is." Velnus returned to her office and filed the dispatch, and then she sat and watched the internal security feed from the station cafeteria, because she could not stop herself from looking. The four humans were eating together at a table near the window. One of them, the big male called Sergeant Fuentes, had produced a small bottle from his pack and was shaking a red liquid onto his food. The station's atmospheric sensors flagged the substance as a mild chemical weapon. The humans were laughing. Captain Marin said something that made the others smile, and Dr. Ose leaned back in her chair and stretched her arms above her head and yawned, showing every single one of her teeth, which were the teeth of an omnivore, flat in the back for grinding and sharp in the front for tearing. Velnus watched them and felt something she had never felt in 11,000 species applications. She felt the vast and ancient cold of the galaxy press in around her, and she understood for the first time that the universe was not a gentle place, and that somewhere out there was a world so terrible and so merciless that it had forged beings who could walk through fire and laugh about it afterward. "They don't know," she whispered to herself in the dim blue light of her office. "They genuinely don't know what they are." The first rule of galactic survival. Deadworlders don't know they're supposed to die. Part 2. Orientation. Curator Prelin of the Salithi Concord stood outside the door of Integration Room 7 and tried very hard to stop his feathers from shaking. He was a small creature, barely reaching the chest of an average human, with hollow bones and a covering of fine blue-gray plumage that rippled with every shift of his emotions. Right now, his emotions were shifting toward raw terror. He had been assigned as the species integration liaison for the human delegation, which meant it was his job to teach them the rules and customs of the Galactic Union, and he had accepted the assignment because he was a professional and because no one else had volunteered. He understood why no one else had volunteered. He had read the file. He pressed the door panel and stepped inside and found all four humans sitting around the orientation table, looking up at him with open and friendly expressions that somehow made everything worse. "Good morning," said Captain Marin, in a voice that was warm and gentle, and belonged to a creature whose ancestors had chased animals to death across open grasslands. "I am Curator Prelin," he said, and he was proud that his voice only cracked a little, "and I will be your guide to life in the Galactic Union. He activated the display wall and brought up the first module, which was the Survival Compatibility Index. The index was a standardized chart that measured how well different species could coexist in shared habitats, taking into account atmospheric needs, gravity tolerance, temperature range, dietary requirements, and 100 other factors. Most Union species clustered between Class 1 and Class 5 on the environmental origin scale, which meant they came from worlds that were broadly similar and broadly safe. Prelin pointed to the cluster on the chart, and then pointed to where humans fell on the scale. They were not on the chart. They were so far off the edge of the chart that Prelin had needed to request a special extended display just to show their position. The humans looked at it with mild curiosity. "Is that bad?" asked Lieutenant Chandrasekharan, a lean man with dark eyes and clever hands that never seemed to stop moving. "It is unprecedented," said Prelin. He moved on to the cultural exchange portion of the orientation, and this was where things began to go sideways. Dr. Amara Osei, the teen xenobiologist, was asking about common companion animals in the Union, and Prelin was describing the small, docile herbivores that several species kept for emotional comfort. "Oh, we have those too," said Dr. Osei, smiling. "But our most popular companion animal is the dog." "And what is a dog?" asked Prelin. "Well, originally they were wolves." Prelin checked his translator because he was certain it had malfunctioned. "Wolves," he repeated, "the large pack-hunting predators listed in your planetary survey as one of the apex carnivores of your world." "That is correct," said Dr. Osei with a cheerful nod. "We spent a few thousand years selectively breeding them until they loved us, and now they live in our homes and sleep in our beds, and we dress them in little sweaters when it gets cold." Prelin felt the room tilt slightly. "You took a predator that could kill you," he said slowly, "and you made it love you." "We did that with cats too," added Sergeant Fuentes from the back of the room, "but the cats are less convinced about the love part." Prelin excused himself to get a glass of water and stood in the hallway for 2 full minutes with his feathers pressed flat against his body, which was the Salithi equivalent of a deep, calming breath. When he returned, he found Lieutenant Chandrasekharan on the floor beneath the Ru's gravity regulation panel, with his hands inside the open casing. "This unit has a misaligned compensator," said Chandrasekharan without looking up. "The gravity in this room has been fluctuating by about 2%, and I noticed it was making you unsteady on your feet, so I am fixing it." "Prelin, you are repairing station infrastructure with your bare hands," said Prelin. "And this," said Chandrasekharan, holding up a thin strip of metal he had bent into a precise shape using nothing but his fingers. "I made a bracket because the original one was cracked." 2 station engineers arrived 3 minutes later and stared at the repair with expressions that mixed horror and admiration in equal measure. The gravity had been fluctuating in that room for 6 months. No one had been able to identify the problem. A human had found it and fixed it in 4 minutes because he had noticed that a small alien was wobbling. Prelin added a note to his file that read, "Extraordinary mechanical aptitude combined with attentiveness to the physical comfort of others," and then underlined it twice. The day continued in much the same fashion. Sergeant Fuentes, attempting to make friendly conversation with a Dravari merchant in the station marketplace, pulled out a small device and showed the merchant a photograph of Earth's ocean. The Dravari species had evolved on a desert moon, where the largest body of liquid was a puddle the size of a dinner plate. The Dravari looked at the image of a vast blue horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. Millions and millions of tons of water, moving in great heaving waves under an open sky. And the Dravari made a sound that Prelin had never heard a Dravari make before, and had to be escorted to the medical bay for mild sedation. Fuentes was mortified and spent the next 2 hours sitting outside the medical bay, waiting to apologize. "I just wanted to show him something pretty," he told Krellin, and he sounded so genuinely upset that Prelin felt an unfamiliar tug somewhere behind his sternum. Captain Marin had clearly noticed that Prelin was frightened of her team. She began making small adjustments throughout the day, speaking more softly, moving more slowly, keeping her hands visible at all times, and giving Prelin extra space when they walked together through the station corridors. This made Prelin more afraid, not less. He had studied predator behavior across 400 species, and he knew that the most dangerous predators in the galaxy were the ones that learned to modulate their threat display. A creature that could be loud and violent was frightening. A creature that chose to be quiet and gentle, despite having the capacity for extraordinary violence, was something else entirely. And yet there was a moment, late in the day, when Prelin stumbled on a loose deck plate, and Captain Marin caught him before he hit the ground. Hands were so careful, and so steady, and so impossibly gentle, for hands that belonged to a persistence predator from a Class 12 death world. And she set him back on his feet and asked if he was all right, with such simple, honest concern in her eyes, that Prelin felt the terror crack, just a little, just enough to let something else through, something that might have been trust. That night he sat in his quarters and composed his first official report on the human delegation. He wrote and deleted and rewrote for over an hour, trying to find the words that would make the council understand what he had seen. In the end, he kept it simple. "They are not aggressive," he wrote. "They are not hostile. They are simply built for a universe that is trying to kill them at all times, and they do not appear to have noticed." He filed the report and turned off the light, and lay in the dark, listening to the hum of the station around him. The other side of the habitat ring, 4 humans were sleeping in a room whose gravity had been fixed by one of their own, because he had noticed a small bird-like alien was unsteady on his feet. Prelin closed his eyes. His feathers would not stop shaking, but he was beginning to think that maybe it was not entirely from fear. The first rule of galactic survival. Deadworlders don't know they're supposed to die. Part 3. The incident at Relay 7. The distress call came in at 0347 station time, cutting through the quiet of the night watch like a blade. Relay Station 7, a deep space communications hub on the border between Union-controlled space and the Craven Dominion, was under attack. 200 Union civilians were on board. A Craven raiding fleet of 6 warships had surrounded the station and was already cutting through the outer hull. Captain Josephina Marin was awake and dressed and on the bridge of the UES Montevideo within 4 minutes of the alert, and she had the ship moving within 5. "How far?" she asked. 6 hours at maximum burn," said Lieutenant Chandrasekaran from the engineering console. "The nearest Union military flotilla is 40 hours out," added the communications officer. Marin did not hesitate, did not consult anyone above her rank. "Maximum burn," she said. "All hands prepare for combat boarding operations." The Craven were the nightmare of the Galactic Union. They were tall and broad and armored in natural bone plating that could stop a standard sidearm round, and they fought with a brutality that had made them the most feared raiders in 3 sectors. No Union species had ever successfully repelled a Craven boarding action. The standard protocol was to surrender immediately and negotiate ransom, because fighting the Craven was considered not merely foolish, but physically impossible. The Montevideo was a diplomatic vessel, carrying a crew of 42, of which only 12 were trained for close combat. 12 humans against a Craven raiding force. The math was insane. Marin did not care about the math. They arrived at Relay 7 to find the station dark and leaking atmosphere from 3 breach points, and 2 Craven assault shuttles locked to the docking ring like parasites on the skin of a dying animal. Marin assembled her boarding team in the airlock. Sergeant Fuentes checked his weapon, and then checked the weapons of every person beside him, and then checked his own weapon again, because that was what he did, and because the people beside him were his people, and he would not let them go through that door with a malfunction. "Rules of engagement," said Marin, and her voice was steady as stone. "Protect the civilians, disable the enemy, and come home alive." "What if they do not wish to be disabled?" asked Fuentes. "Then they have made a poor decision," said Marin. They breached the station through an emergency maintenance hatch on the lower deck, and moved in 2 fire teams through corridors that were dark and cold and thin on oxygen. The Kraven had vented the atmosphere to 40% standard and killed the lights because they could see in the dark, knew that most Union species could not function in low-oxygen environments. They did not know that humans had evolved on a world where the oxygen content fluctuated wildly, where the ancestors of these soldiers had lived and hunted at altitudes that would suffocate a Kraven in minutes. The humans moved through the dark like they had been born in it. The first contact happened on Deck 4, where a Kraven squad of 8 was herding a group of terrified Marithian civilians toward the cargo bay. Fuentes and his fire team came around the corner, and the Kraven saw them, and there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where the Kraven hesitated, because the shapes moving toward them in the dark did not move like any prey species they had ever encountered. They moved like hunters. The engagement lasted 11 seconds. 3 Kraven went down before they could raise their weapons, and the remaining 5 fought hard and with savage skill. Fighting against creatures from a world that made their own look like a garden. Creatures whose bodies were flooded with adrenaline and whose bones were dense as armor, and whose will to protect the small, frightened aliens behind them was a fire that nothing in the galaxy could put out. The Marithian civilians watched from behind an overturned cargo container as 4 humans dismantled 8 Kraven warriors, and they did not understand what they were seeing. On Deck 7, Lieutenant Chandrasekharan encountered a Kraven heavy weapons team that had set up a fortified position controlling the main corridor to the civilian shelters. There was no way around them and no way through them, and every minute they held that position was another minute the civilians were trapped. Chandrasekharan looked at the deck layout, looked at the emergency venting controls, and made a decision that no rational being would make. He sealed himself into the corridor section, pressure suit, locked his magnetic boots to the deck plating, and blew the external hull panel. The vacuum of space ripped through the corridor like the fist of a god. The Kraven heavy weapons team, anchored to nothing, went tumbling into the void. Chandrasekharan stood in the howling emptiness with the stars wheeling around him and his boots locked to the deck and his suit alarms screaming, and he held on. He held on because the people on the other side of the next bulkhead were counting on him, and he had decided that he was not going to let them down. And the cold, empty universe could take that up with him personally if it had a problem. They pulled him back inside 90 seconds later, shaking and frost-burned and grinning like a maniac. On Deck 12, Dr. Amara Osei had set up a field hospital in a storage room and was treating wounded aliens with equipment that had not been designed for human hands. She had a Dravari with plasma burns, a Silathai with a fractured wing, and a Granthari who had gone into shock. And she worked on all 3 of them simultaneously, moving with a focus and a precision that turned the crude little storage room into something that almost resembled hope. A Kraven warrior broke through the door. Osei put herself between the wounded and the Kraven, and she was a scientist, a doctor, a woman who had dedicated her life to healing and not to harm. But she was also a daughter of Earth, and when the warrior came for her patients, she picked up a metal supply rod, and she did not back down. Fuentes arrived 30 seconds later and dealt with the situation, but for those 30 seconds, Amara Osei, xenobiologist, 140 pounds, stood alone against a creature twice her size and did not move. Because they were her patients, and that was enough. The battle turned on Deck 3, where Captain Marin walked into the station's communications hub, opened a channel to the Kraven fleet, commander on his own encrypted frequency, and spoke. "This is Captain Josephina Marin of the United Earthship Montevideo," she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried the weight of a species that had been fighting since before it could walk upright. "Your boarding parties have been neutralized. Your heavy weapons teams have been eliminated, and I have 12 soldiers on this station who are very tired and very angry and who have not yet had breakfast. You have one opportunity to withdraw your fleet, and I suggest you take it, because if you do not, I will board your flagship next, and Commander, I want you to understand that I am not making a threat. I am telling you what is going to happen." The channel was silent for a long time. Then the Craven fleet turned and burned hard for the border. It was the first recorded retreat of a Craven raiding force in the history of the Galactic Union. The rescued civilians were gathered in the station's main hall when the lights came back on. 200 beings of a dozen different species, blinking in the sudden brightness and staring at the 12 humans who stood among them, battered and bleeding, and still standing. A young Merithian girl, small and wide-eyed and trembling, walked up to Captain Marin and tugged on her sleeve. "Are you a monster?" the girl asked. Marin looked down at her, and the hardness that had carried her through the battle fell away like a mask. And what was underneath was just a woman, tired and hurting, and so very far from home. She knelt down so that she was eye level with the child. "No, sweetheart," she said, and she smiled, and it was the most honest thing she had done all day. "I am just stubborn." The first rule of galactic survival: Deadworlders don't know they're supposed to die. Part 4. What the Galaxy Learned. The emergency session of the Galactic Union Security Council was called within 18 hours of the Relay 7 incident, and it was the most heavily attended session in living memory. Every species with a seat sent their senior representative. Several species that did not have seats sent observers anyway, and dared the council to remove them. The chamber was vast and circular, built in tiers that rose like the inside of a bowl, and every tier was full, and every face was turned toward the central speaking platform where the evidence was being presented. The evidence was a recording from Relay 7's internal security system, and it showed 12 humans doing something that every tactical model in the Union said was impossible. The chamber was very quiet while the recording played. Began, Ambassador Korath of the Veldrathi hegemony was the first to speak, and he spoke for the isolationists, the faction that wanted humanity sealed behind a quarantine barrier and kept far away from the rest of civilized space. "What we have witnessed is not heroism," Korath said, his heavy exoskeleton clicking as he gestured toward the display. "It is a demonstration of what an uncontrolled Deathworld species is capable of when it decides to act. Today they acted in our favor. But what happens when they do not? What happens when a species that can survive explosive decompression and fight in vacuum and terrify the Craven into retreat decides that it wants something we are not willing to give? We cannot predict them, we cannot contain them, and we cannot match them. And any species we cannot predict or contain or match is a species we must keep at a distance." The isolationist bloc was large, and the fear in the chamber was real, and Korath knew how to use both. But then Prelin stood up. Small, blue-feathered, trembling Prelin, who had to request a height extension on the speaking platform just to be seen above the podium, stood before the assembled might of the Galactic Union and spoke for the integrationists. "Ambassador Korath asks what happens when humans act against us," said Prelin, and his voice shook, but it did not break. "And I ask the ambassador this: when in the entire history of our contact with this species have they acted against anyone who is not already trying to hurt someone else? I have lived with these beings for weeks now, and I have watched them, and I will tell you what I have seen. I have seen an engineer fix a gravity unit in a room that was not his because he noticed that I was unsteady on my feet. I have seen a soldier sit outside a medical bay for 2 hours because he accidentally frightened someone and could not bear the thought that he had caused distress. I have seen a doctor stand between a wounded alien and a craven warrior with nothing but a metal rod, because her patients were behind her and she had decided that was where the line was. I have seen a captain divert her ship without orders and without hesitation, because 200 strangers were in danger, and she did not stop to ask whether saving them was in her strategic interest. These beings are not a threat to us, Ambassador. They are the most loyal, the most stubborn, the most irrationally compassionate species I have ever encountered. And the fact that they come from a world that should have killed them 1,000 times over does not make them dangerous. It makes them miraculous. The chamber stirred, and Prelin stepped down on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. And then the council called its final witness. Captain Josephina Marin walked to the speaking platform in her dress uniform, which still had a repair patch on the left sleeve from where a craven blade had cut through. And she looked out at the hundreds of alien faces looking down at her, and she took a breath. She was not a politician, and she knew it. She was a soldier and a captain, and a woman from a small town on a planet that the rest of the galaxy considered a death trap. And she had never spoken to a crowd this large, and she was not going to pretend to be something she was not. I am not going to stand here and tell you that humans are safe, she said, because we are not. We come from a world that has been trying to kill us since the moment we crawled out of the ocean, and it has not stopped trying. And we have not stopped fighting back, and that has made us into something that I understand is frightening to you. I have seen the way you look at us when we eat food that your sensors call a chemical weapon, and I have seen the way you step back when we move too fast. And I have seen the way Prelin's feathers shake when I walk into a room, even though he tries so hard to hide it. I see it, and I understand it, and I am not offended by it. But I want you to understand something about us. Where I come from, the ground shakes and the sky burns, and the water rises, and the air itself can kill you. And we did not survive that by being the strongest, or the fastest, or the most vicious. We survived because we learned to look out for each other. When the ground shook, we pulled each other out of the rubble. When the sky burned, we shared our shelter. When the water rose, we built boats big enough for everyone. We did not evolve in spite of our world trying to kill us. We evolved because of it. Because a world that hostile does not allow the luxury of selfishness. You survive together, or you do not survive at all. That is all we know how to do. That is the only thing we have ever known how to do. When we heard that 200 of your people were in danger, we did not stop to check whether they were the right species or the right faction, or whether saving them would benefit us politically. We went because they needed help, and we could give it. That is the whole secret. That is all we are. The chamber was silent. Marin stood in that silence with her patched sleeve and her tired eyes and waited. The vote was called an hour later. The result was not close. Humanity was granted full provisional membership in the Galactic Union by a margin of 73%, the fastest species ascension in the history of the institution. But the vote was not the thing that mattered. The thing that mattered was what happened in the days and weeks that followed, as the recording from Relay 7 spread across every network and every station and every colony in Union space. Species that had never heard of Sol 3 watched 12 humans hold a station against the Craven, and then watched their captain kneel down to comfort a frightened child. And something shifted. The word Deadworlder had always been theoretical, an academic term for a hypothetical species from a world too hostile to produce intelligence, a thought experiment, a campfire story for spacers. Now it was real, and it was attached to faces and voices and names, and the galaxy did not quite know what to do with that. But it was learning. The Craven Dominion sent a formal diplomatic protest to the Union Council, and then quietly began reinforcing every installation within 10 light-years of human space. Intelligence reports noted that the Craven had developed a new word for humans in their tactical lexicon. The word translated roughly as, the ones who run toward danger. It was not a compliment. It was a warning, and in his small office on Kethera Prime, Curator Preland sat down at his terminal and opened the doc. Species Registry File for Homo sapiens. He stared at the blank field marked Threat Classification for a very long time. Then he typed, Survival-Oriented Community Bonding Species. Threat level to hostiles, extreme. Threat level to allies, none. He paused and then added one final line. Addendum, will adopt anything, exercise caution around their pets. He filed the entry and closed his terminal and sat in the quiet of his office, and for the first time since he had met the humans, his feathers were completely still. The first rule of galactic survival. Deadworlders don't know they're supposed to die. Part 5. The Rule. 5 years had passed since the incident at Relay 7, and the galaxy was not the same. It was better. Human engineers served on stations across 3 sectors, their insane tolerance for hazardous environments making them the most requested technical specialists in Union space. They worked in toxic atmospheres and high radiation zones and crushing gravity wells, and they did it cheerfully, and they fixed things that had been broken for years, and they always noticed when someone near them was uncomfortable and did something about it. Human medics were stationed in every frontier zone, and they had earned a reputation that no amount of money could buy. They would treat anyone. They would go anywhere. They would walk into plague zones and war zones and disaster zones with their sleeves rolled up and their hands steady. And they would not leave until every patient was stable. And if you asked them why, they would look at you with genuine confusion and say something like, because they needed help, as if that were the most obvious answer in the universe. Human soldiers formed the backbone of the Union Rapid Response Corps, a joint defense force that had not existed 5 years ago because no species had been willing to be the ones who ran toward the crisis instead of away from it. The humans volunteered. They always volunteered. Sergeant Tomas Fuentes, now Colonel Fuentes, commanded the Corps' 1st Battalion, and he had turned it into something the galaxy had never seen before. A military unit made up of 30 different species, all of them trained to human standards, all of them held together by a simple philosophy that Fuentes repeated so often it had become the unofficial motto of the Corps. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody fights alone. And if you have time to complain, have time to help. The Craven Dominion, after 2 more failed engagements with human-supported fleets, had signed its first non-aggression pact in the entire history of its existence. The signing ceremony was tense and formal, and the Craven ambassador looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the universe. And when a journalist asked him why the Dominion had agreed to the pact, the ambassador stared at her for a long moment and then said one sentence. They do not stop, and we have no doctrine for an enemy that does not stop. The journalist asked for clarification, and the ambassador declined to provide any. Lieutenant Ravi Chandrasekaran had left the military and gone into civilian engineering, where he had designed a new generation of emergency pressure suits based on his experience of standing in hard vacuum with nothing but magnetic boots and stubbornness. The suits were now standard equipment on every station in Union space. Insisted they be manufactured in sizes that fit every registered species, not just humans. And he had refused to patent the design. People are going to get blown into space, he had told the Manufacturing Council with a shrug. They should have a decent suit when it happens, and they should not have to pay extra for it. Dr. Amara Ose had established the first cross-species medical training program on Kethera Prime, teaching alien physicians how to work in crisis conditions, how to improvise with unfamiliar equipment, and how to stand between their patients and whatever was coming through the door. She never mentioned the Craven Warrior on Deck 12. Her students heard about it anyway. They always heard about it. Captain Josephina Marin was not a captain anymore. She was Admiral Marin now, and she commanded the Union's first contact fleet, the ships that were sent to greet new species when they took their first steps into the wider galaxy. Had a reputation for kindness and patience and an iron will that had faced down 3 interstellar crises without flinching. And the species she had welcomed into the Union spoke of her the way some cultures spoke of ancient guardians, with a warmth that bordered on reverence. She was uncomfortable with this, and dealt with it by ignoring it entirely. And Prelin, small, careful, brave Prelin, who had once trembled at the sound of a human footstep, was now Director of Species Integration for the entire Galactic Union. His office on Cathara Prime was small because he had refused a larger one, and it was decorated with things that no other Salithi office in the galaxy contained. There was a knitted scarf hanging on the back of his chair, made by Fuentes's mother from yarn she had shipped across 4 relay stations because her son had mentioned that his little bird friend got cold easily. There was a child's drawing pinned to the wall, sent by the Merithian girl from Relay 7, showing stick-figure humans and a small blue bird standing together under a yellow sun, and underneath, in wobbly letters, it said, "My family." There was a potted succulent on his desk, a gift from Dr. Ose, and Prelin was terrified of killing it, and watered it according to a strict schedule he had programmed into his personal terminal with 17 separate reminder alerts. And there was a photograph in a simple frame next to the plant, showing 4 humans and 1 Silithi standing together on the observation deck of the Montevideo. And in the photograph, Prelin was sitting on Fuentes's shoulder, and his feathers were smooth and settled, and he was looking at the camera with an expression that even humans could read as happiness. The humans called him family. He called them his flock. Neither side fully understood the other's word for it, but it did not matter, because the feeling was the same. On this particular morning, 5 years and 3 days after a small bird-like alien had walked into Integration Room 7 and met the most terrifying species in the galaxy, Director Prelin stood at the front of a lecture hall in the Galactic Union Academy and looked out at a new class of integration cadets. There were dozens of them, young and eager and nervous, representing 16 different species, and they looked up at him the way he had once looked up at the galaxy, with wonder and uncertainty and hope. He told them about the classification system and the Survival Compatibility Index, and the old assumptions that had guided Union policy for centuries. He told them about the Craven and the Relay and the Vote. And then he told them the rule. When you encounter a species from a death world, he said, and his voice was steady now, steady as it had been when he stood before the Security Council, steady as the hands of the captain who had caught him when he stumbled. Universe is vast and cruel and inventive. You will be tempted to fear them. You will look at their biology and their history and their capacity for violence, and you will think these beings are dangerous. And you will be right, they are. But here is what the models and the classifications and the threat assessments will never tell you. Deadworlders do not know they are supposed to die. The galaxy told them it was impossible, and they did not listen. Their sun burned them, and they put on hats. Their world shook, and they rebuilt. The void was cold and empty, and they filled it with music and stubbornness and love. They are not dangerous because they are strong. They are dangerous because they care. And they will fight harder for you than they will ever fight for themselves. That is the first rule of galactic survival. Learn it. Live it. And when a Deadworlder offers you their hand, take it. The lecture hall was silent. Prelin let the silence hold because some things needed space to land. Then a hand went up in the front row. It was a young Merithian woman, tall and bright-eyed, with the particular steadiness of someone who had survived something terrible when she was very small, and had come out the other side with a spine made of starlight. Prelin recognized her immediately. "Director Prelin," she said, and there was a grin on her face that she was not even trying to hide. Is it true that you once fainted when a human showed you a picture of a dog? The lecture hall erupted. Prelin's feathers puffed out to twice their normal volume, and he drew himself up to his full and deeply unimpressive height, and said, "That is a gross exaggeration of a minor physiological response to an unexpected visual stimulus." And the cadets laughed harder, and Prelin tried to maintain his dignity and failed. Sound that was the Salithi equivalent of a laugh. Somewhere out on the frontier, far from the warmth of the lecture hall and the laughter of the cadets, Admiral Josephina Marin stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched a new star rise over the horizon of an uncharted world. The light was golden and unfamiliar, and it touched her face like a promise. She thought about a small girl tugging on her sleeve. She thought about a bird-like alien who had been so afraid of her and had chosen to be brave anyway. She thought about the people she had carried, and the people who had carried her, and the long, strange, beautiful road that had brought a stubborn woman from a deadly little world to the edge of the unknown. She smiled. Out here at the edge of everything, where the stars were new and the dark was wide, and the universe stretched on forever in every direction, she was not afraid. She had never been afraid. She was from Earth, after all. All and Earthlings did not know they were supposed to die.